3 weeks into melon bloom, 14-year-old Amina Carter stood in the quietest section of her family's field and counted yellow flowers that no bee had visited. The morning was cool and grey. Hundreds of cantaloupe blossoms had opened after sunrise, but the usual movement above the vines was missing. No steady humming drifted between the rows. Only the wind disturbed the leaves. Her father, Marcus, cut open one of the first developing melons. The fruit looked large from a distance, but one side had remained flat. Inside, the flesh had formed unevenly, and the seed cavity was thin and incomplete. On nearby vines, several young fruits had already begun turning yellow at the stem. By the end of the week, they would fall. Amina looked toward the narrow bands of wildflowers she had planted beside the field. Bumblebees still moved among the purple mountain mint and yellow partridge pea. A few crossed from the flowers into the melon rows. The difference was small, but it was the only part of the field that did not feel empty. If you enjoy quiet stories about farming, patience, and people who notice what everyone else overlooks, subscribe and join us. Sometimes a harvest depends on something a farmer cannot plant, own, or command. A month earlier, the flower strips had been the joke of the Carter farm. Amina had collected seed for black-eyed Susan, blanket flower, clover, partridge pea, and several locally suited native plants. Instead of creating one decorative patch near the house, she marked long narrow bands beside selected cantaloupe rows. Her older brother, Jamal, asked whether she planned to sell bouquets with the melons. A neighboring farmer leaned against the fence and said the customers might enjoy picking flowers while they waited for the fruit to ripen. Marcus was less amused. Every strip of soil taken from production meant fewer vines. Tall flowers could hide weeds, interfere with equipment, and compete for water. Amina's idea appeared to turn useful farmland into decoration. She did not argue. She placed tall wooden markers at the ends of each strip and wrote down which plant should flower first, which should bloom with the melons, and which might continue afterward. Amina was not growing flowers for customers. She was building a place where pollinators could find food before the melon blossoms opened, and after they closed. The Carter family had farmed in Sumter County, Georgia, for 3 generations. Amina's grandfather had grown peanuts, corn, and vegetables on the same land. Marcus later shifted part of the farm into watermelons and cantaloupes because they could bring more income from a smaller area. But melons demanded something the family could not control with a tractor or irrigation valve. Their flowers needed visitors. Male and female blossoms opened across the vines in the morning. Pollen had to be moved repeatedly between them during a short period. When a flower received too little, the fruit might fail to form, stop growing, or develop unevenly. Amina had begun counting insects the previous summer. She selected several groups of flowers and watched each one for the same amount of time after sunrise. In an old-school notebook, she recorded honeybees, bumblebees, small solitary bees, butterflies, beetles, and other visitors. The pattern surprised her. Near the ditch where wild plants still bloomed, the flowers received more visits. Along the cleanly mowed center of the farm, activity dropped. Once the main crop finished flowering, there was almost nothing left for the insects to eat. Grandmother Lillian remembered when the field edges had looked less orderly. Clover grew beside fences. Hollow stems stood through winter. Wildflowers opened at different times along the ditches. The margins attracted insects, birds, and small animals that disappeared as the farm became cleaner. The changes had seemed sensible. Short vegetation made equipment easier to operate. Removing weeds reduced competition. Bare edges looked controlled and professional. But the farm had also removed much of the food and shelter that wild pollinators used between crop blooms. Lillian brought Amina an old agricultural booklet describing flower strips and pollinator habitat. It explained that a mixture of plants blooming at different times could support insects throughout more of the season. Amina understood the central problem. It was not enough to hope that bees would appear on the exact morning the melons needed them. The farm had to give them a reason to remain nearby before that morning arrived. She could not order a wild bee to visit a cantaloupe flower. She could only make the field worth visiting. Amina's first flower strip was a failure. She scattered seed over a hard section beside the irrigation ditch and assumed spring rain would do the rest. Some seeds washed into low spots. Others remained on the surface until birds found them. The few seedlings that emerged were quickly surrounded by fast-growing weeds. By the time the cantaloupe vines began spreading, most of the intended flowers were still too small to bloom. Another strip sat too close to the turning area at the end of the rows. A tractor operator saw the low wooden markers too late and mowed through nearly half of it. The remaining plants leaned beneath chop stems and tire tracks. After a heavy rain, the third strip appeared in scattered clumps rather than a continuous band. Seeds had moved downhill and collected against the ditch bank. Marcus walked the length of the experiment. "We gave up growing space for this," he said, "and there is not much here but weeds." Amina could not disagree. She had treated the flowers as though they would grow anywhere simply because they were considered wild. But native plants still needed suitable soil, correct timing, light, moisture, and protection while becoming established. She started again on a smaller scale. With Lillian's help, she selected species with different bloom periods. Some would flower quickly in spring. Others would peak during the melon season. A few would continue into late summer. Amina removed the worst weeds before sowing. She loosened the upper soil instead of scattering seed over a hard crust. She planted in small groups so she could identify the seedlings and control weeds around them. She moved the strips away from tractor turns and left a narrow, clear lane beside each one. The short markers were replaced with tall painted posts visible from the equipment seat. Most importantly, she left a control section of cantaloupes with no flower strip nearby. If the idea worked, she wanted a fair comparison. The first successful blooms were small and widely separated. For several days, Amina saw flies and beetles but few bees. Then one morning, a large bumblebee landed on the partridge pea. It moved slowly from flower to flower before crossing into the cantaloupe rows. The sight lasted less than a minute. Amina wrote it down anyway. One visitor did not prove the system worked, but it proved the field was no longer invisible. The main cantaloupe bloom began during a week of difficult weather. Cool mornings slowed insect activity. Short rain showers arrived without warning. Strong wind passed over the open field and made it harder for small bees to move between flowers. At the same time, a beekeeper who usually supplied hives to several farms in the county called Marcus. Some of his colonies were weaker than expected. He could not deliver as many hives as the growers had requested. The cantaloupe flowers did not wait. Each morning, hundreds opened across the vines. By afternoon, many had already begun closing. Every mist mattered. Marcus walked the rows and saw female flowers without visitors. He knew that poor pollination would not always be visible immediately. The damage would appear days later when young fruit stopped growing or formed badly. Amina returned to her counting method. She observed the same number of flowers for the same period in both sections. In the control rows, several observation periods passed without a single bee. Near the flower strips, activity was also lower than normal, but it did not disappear. Bumblebees worked during the cooler hours. Small dark ground nesting bees moved between the mountain mint and the cantaloupes. Later in the morning, a few honeybees arrived. The strips did not create a cloud of pollinators. They did not replace every missing hive, but they provided food between the brief waves of melon bloom, and some wild bees had begun using the area before the difficult week arrived. Several days later, the difference appeared. In the control section, more young fruits yellowed and dropped. Some that continued growing developed one full side and one narrow side. Near the flower bands, losses still occurred. A storm had damaged vines, and some blossoms received too few visits. But more fruit continued developing evenly. Marcus remained careful. A young melon could still fail from disease, heat, or lack of water. The experiment would not be judged until harvest. Even so, he called the field crew together. "Do not mow those strips," he said. "Leave room around every one." It was the first time the flowers had been treated as part of the crop. By harvest, the comparison was visible before anyone weighed a single cantaloupe. The control section still produced good fruit. Amina had never claimed it would become empty without the flower strips. Bees had visited those rows too, and many melons developed normally. But the sorting table revealed a pattern. More fruit from the control area was undersized, uneven, or flattened on one side. Some had grown enough to harvest but could not be sold at the best grade. The sections near the flower strips were not perfect either. Heat had weakened several vines. Insects damaged a small number of fruits. Some young melons dropped despite repeated bee visits. Still, a larger share of the harvest developed into evenly shaped, marketable cantaloupes. Marcus kept the sections separate and compared both total weight and saleable fruit. The flowers had not enlarged the melons by themselves. They had helped more blossoms receive enough pollen during a short and difficult period. The neighbor who had joked about Amina opening a flower shop arrived while the family was sorting. He studied the pile of misshapen fruit from the control section. Then he walked to the nearest strip and watched bumblebees moving over the mountain mint. "What did you plant here?" he asked. Amina did not remind him of the joke. Instead, she showed him the first failed strip, where weeds still outnumbered useful flowers. She explained that the method required planning, preparation, and maintenance. Flower strips occupied land. Poorly selected plants could become troublesome weeds. Some species attracted insects that did not help the crop. Establishment could take more than one season. Large melon fields might still require managed honeybee hives. The strips were not a replacement for every other pollination strategy. They were habitat. The following spring, the Carters expanded only the most successful bands. They added several patches of undisturbed soil for ground nesting bees and left selected hollow stems standing where they would not interfere with equipment. They did not allow the farm to become overgrown. They simply stopped treating every wild edge as wasted space. When the melon flowers opened again, the field was not filled with an enormous swarm. It did not need to be. There was movement between the rows. Bumblebees crossed from the flower strips. Small solitary bees worked close to the ground. The morning carried a sound that had been missing the year before. Amina had never commanded the bees to save the harvest. She had only given them food, shelter, and a reason to stay close enough to help.